Hello, welcome to our video. In this video, we will inform you about verbal and nonverbal communication. Let's dive right in. We will start with a work-related dialogue.
Excuse me, Wang, I don't understand.
In this example, the person is addressing the boss with his first name, which is typical Swedish. In China, this is considered impolite to call someone in a higher position by their first name. Then, the next example shows us a person that started to understand the culture and addresses the boss in a correct way, with position and last name.
Dr. Wei, I disagree. I think we should do it like this instead.
This person is from the Netherlands, which is a low-power distance culture, and is used to speak his mind during meetings and is not afraid to disagree, which is unusual in high-power distance cultures. The third bubble is a person from China thinking, "Whatever Dr. Wei says, I am not in a position to disagree." This shows the different perspectives of how to address and act in higher power distance cultures. He takes the order from Dr. Wei and does not question the doctor's authority. He does this in silence because of the high power distance culture. The three examples above shows the differences between high and low power distance cultures. The last example is a person from the United States of America apologizing to the Chinese boss.
I'm sorry for not delivering on time. I had a headache and my children got sick.
And so on. There are different ways to apologize in different cultures. In this example, the person who is apologizing is from America, where people tend to explain why they did something wrong. Japan, on the other hand, only apologizes without explaining their actions. In this example, where the boss is Chinese, he probably doesn't want to hear an explanation. Now for the map. Based on Hofstede's 5 cultural dimensions, there are some distinct differences between Western countries and China. China has a high power distance, masculinity and long-term orientation, but lower individualism. But on uncertainty avoidance, they are all quite alike. The Netherlands and the United States have a higher uncertainty avoidance than Sweden and China. As for the communication process, communication is a complex and intricate process that involves the exchange of messages between interactants, both verbally and non-verbals. In order to understand the complexity, we need to build a vocabulary of its elemental units. On the left, you can see the 5 elemental units of communication, which we will explain now. People communicate to exchange information and meanings. These messages may be knowledge, ideas, concepts, thoughts, or emotions. The second step is to select messages, embed messages in signals, and sending these to each other. This process is called encoding. Signals are observable behaviors that do not necessarily have inherent meaning, but carry messages that are encoded during communication. These are the specific verbal language and nonverbal behaviors that are encoded when a message is sent. The specific sensory modalities by which signals are sent and messages are retrieved, such as sight or sound, are referred to as channels. The translation of the encoder signals into meaningful messages refers to the process of decoding. The picture on the right illustrates the process of communication. On the first panel, the intended message is encoded into signals, which are culturally influenced. Through various channels, the message is sent to the recipient, shown in panel 2. In the third and fourth panel, you can see the process of decoding. The recipient unpacks the encoder's message with his own cultural background, and his own interpretation follows. As already seen in the first example, different cultural backgrounds can lead to misunderstandings in the communication process. We will shed light on these difficulties later in the video. Now moving on to nonverbal communication. An example of a nonverbal communicative disparity is what we interpret as the OK gesture, by placing the index finger and the thumb on each other as seen in the picture above. This gesture is interpreted differently around the world. In Japan, for instance, the symbol represents money. Moving over to South America, in Brazil, it means something more vulgar, and in the Middle East, the gesture represents the evil eye and brings bad luck. This is but one example of one of many disparities when it comes to gesture interpretation between cultures. Nonverbal communication means that messages are sent without using words. Most people are not always aware of their nonverbal communication. Nonverbal channels are actually more important in understanding the meaning and the emotional states of speakers. There are different aspects of nonverbal communication. The first one is proxemics and means the use of space. It indicates how close people stand to each other and how big personal space is. The second one is haptics. It refers to how we touch the other person when communicating. When it comes to haptics, there are numerous dimensions. Italy is, for example, a close contact country, and the Netherlands is a non-contact country. The third one is paralinguistic cues. It refers to intonation, silence, volume, pitch, and speech rate during talking. Also, vocalization such as swallowing, clearing the throat, and non-fluencies such as etc. is also part of paralanguage. Moreover, olfactics is the meaning of odor. It explains that smell plays a role in interactions. And then finally there's chronemics, which has to do with time and can be divided into subtopics. The first one is polychronic, which means that time is something elastic. Different things can be done at the same time. It's focused on the present, lateness often incurred, and people don't always have the schedule for the whole day. The second one is monochronic, which means that time is often in blocks. Often one thing at one time can be done. Time is seen as precise and punctuality is important. Often schedules are being used. Then there is kinesics, which can be divided into 5 different parts. The first one is emblems, which are hand gestures and have direct literal translation, signs for peace, for example. Then there's speech illustrators, which are directly linked to speech and serve to illustrate what is being said. For example, banging your fist on the table. Latin American and Middle Eastern cultures encourage use of large gestures, and Asian cultures discourage the use of such gestures. Then there's affect displays, which are facial expressions of emotion. Furthermore, there are regulators which govern or direct a conversation, like nodding your head. And finally, there's adapters, which are actions that satisfy physical or physiological needs, like scratching an itch. So, nonverbal communication can replace or repeat verbal messages. It can emphasize messages or add something to a message to make it stronger. Moving on to difficulties. We're now going to talk about difficulties in intercultural communications. There are 7 different factors that can affect the communication. The first one is the assumption of similarities. This means that people assume that others are the same, or at least similar enough to make communication easy. The second one is language differences, which means that it can be difficult to understand that other cultures can have different meaning of a word or a phrase. This often happens when you speak a language that is not your native tongue. Then there's nonverbal misinterpretations, which is simply body language that is misinterpreted, as well as preconceptions and stereotypes. These can prevent us from viewing others and their communications objectively. We also have tendency to evaluate, which means that different cultures' values may generate negative evaluations of others. We also have high anxiety or tensions, which embodies that people feel higher anxiety and stress when communicating in an intercultural context, and this can negatively affect the communication process. The last bubble describes uncertainty and ambiguity. The message can be misinterpreted by uncertainty and ambiguity, but it can also be due to the confusing nonverbal communication. This creates a negative chain of reaction that can increase the potential for conflict. For example, people from expressive cultures can more easily judge people from reserved cultures as untrustworthy, sly, or shifty. Now moving on to the improving of intercultural communication. Intercultural communication is plagued by disputes and incomprehensible situations for both parties. In order to improve intercultural communication, there are certain goals that must be achieved to ensure near flawless intercultural communicative situations. These goals are achieving mindfulness, uncertainty reduction, the understanding of the concept of face in different cultures, and emotion regulation. When talking about mindfulness, we mean that a person is conscious of their own culture and that they are open to new information and multiple perspectives. As for uncertainty reduction, we mean that it is important to reduce the uncertainty between parties, for it is nearly impossible for the 2 unacquainted individuals from different cultures to understand one another's signals and interpret the message properly, because uncertainty renders them inherently ambiguous. Another important aspect of intercultural communication is the understanding of the concept of face. especially when a conflict arises between individuals from a collectivistic and an individualistic culture. Face in collectivistic cultures refers to an individual's public appearance, which has to be maintained and upheld, and which can be damaged when exposed to shameful or embarrassing situations. And finally, one needs to take into account emotion regulation. This entails that one needs to regulate feelings when communicating. Mistakes and misunderstandings are inevitable, and one should not be led down a path of ethnocentrism simply due to the fact that mistakes were made. By not acting immediately on negative thoughts arising from these misunderstandings and solving them, intercultural communication can succeed. These factors lead to the ultimate goal of improving intercultural communication. With this said, we hope that you enjoyed this video and enjoy your mind.